Hi everyone, so this is our appraisal project. We decided to choose a subject property in Austin, Texas at 1007 Blue Martin Drive. The reason we chose Austin specifically is because it's a really big up and coming city with a lot of growth and a lot of people are moving there, whether that's single people, families, even older people deciding to retire there because it is a cheaper place to live, but there's also lots of things to do around the city. So here are just a couple photos of our subject property. You can see that it's somewhat renovated, which is a little bit different than some of our comparable properties. You can see that the kitchen and the bathrooms have newer appliances, which is something that a lot of buyers are definitely looking for. And you can see that the bedrooms are pretty big. And then there's a large backyard with a lot of space for a family specifically, and then a patio, which is definitely something that a lot of families look for as well. So this was sold by Stanberry Realtors by Sarah Madeira. The list price was $346,000. It's a single family residential house. It was built in 1976. It's 1,600 square feet, which is about $211 per square foot. And we'll see some differences with that in our comps. And then the lot size is about 1.17 acres. The last time it was sold was March 26th, so that was when we were working on this project. And then there's 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and then it's in the neighborhood of Woodland Village of Anderson Mill. So through the sales comparison approach, the cost approach, the direct capitalization, and the discounted cash flow approach, we came to a conclusion that the estimated value of our home was going to be $307,950. So it's a little bit different than the sales price, but we'll explain that later.
The next thing we looked at was the market condition analysis. And so first we looked at demographics. The subject property is located in Williamson County, Texas, which is just outside of Austin. The population was 590,551 in 2019. The growth rates were at 39.8% between April of 2010 and July of 2019. And there were 87.6% of people under the age of 65 and 25.2% under the age of 18. The population per square mile was 378 people, which is much higher than the US population per square mile of 87.4. And this shows that Williamson is a very heavily populated area. Then we looked at the economy. There were 205,609 housing units in July of 2019. 68.4% of those were owner occupied. The median value of the homes were $262,300, which is greater than the US average value of $217,500. 180,160 households were in Williamson in 2019, and they averaged 3.02 people per household. Finally, we looked at the healthcare and education, which showed that 93.2% of people in Williamson hold at least a high school diploma, which is higher than the US average of 88%. Also, we found that 41.3% have a bachelor's degree, which is much higher than the US of 32.1%. And we also found that 12.4% of Williamson's population does not have health insurance. Next, we looked at the distance to significant landmarks. One thing that I found really interesting was that all the high school, middle school, and elementary school were less than a mile away. So it's really easy commute to all of those if they have young children. It's also really close to the international airport, which should be under a 30-minute commute, given it's 23 miles away. It's also close to the Texas State Capitol, 16 miles away, which shows that it's close to the city center. And it also is not that far from University of Texas at Austin. This is the zoning map, and the zone for it was Rocky Road, which is up at the top. And then this is an aerial view of subject and comparables. We found all of the comparables within a really close range to each other, which helps us have a better comparison for our appraisal value.
So our first comparable was picked because it was very similar to our subject property. They both have 3 bedrooms and 2 baths. and the square foot price per square foot only differs by $7. However, comparable 1 was 6 years newer. For comparable 2, they were also very similar to the subject property, except for there was a distinct difference, which was that comparable 2 had an additional bedroom and was 200 square feet bigger than our subject property. For comparable 3, it was also chosen because it was almost identical to our subject property. The subject property price per square foot was $211 and comparables 3 was $207. So they were very similar, but comparable 3 also had an additional garage. For comparable 4, it had the same lot size and it was also built in the same year as our subject property. However, comparable 4 was $26,000 less than our subject property. For comparable 5, it was a smaller home than our subject property. However, it was priced $29,000 more than the subject property due to its updated fixtures. So we picked that one and then adjusted for that in the sales comparison approach, which you'll see. And then for comparable 6, we chose because it was also very similar to our subject property, except it had an additional bedroom. So for our sales comparison adjustments, we adjusted based on bedrooms, year built, garages, and then square footage. So for bedrooms, we compared house number 2 and 6 because they were alike in every aspect except for comparable 6 had an additional bedroom, and we determined that the additional bedroom would add an additional $10,000. So for year built, we chose comparable 1 and 4 because they were also extremely similar, except for comparable 1 was built 7 years after comparable 4. So we determined that each year newer would add an additional $3,571. And then for garages, we chose to compare the subject property and comparable 3 because they were also almost identical in all their characteristics, except for the subject property had a 1-car garage and the comparable property had a 2-car garage. So we determined that the additional garage would add an additional $6,000. And then for square footage, we adjusted by taking the average price per square foot for the subject property and the 6 comparable properties and found it to be $223 per square feet. We found the difference. Then we found the difference in the square footage between each comparable and the subject property and multiplied it by our average price. And then we either added or subtracted it to our comparable houses. So on this side, we can see the sales comparison statistics. So it's basically, we just mapped out all of our, we adjusted for the bedrooms, year built, garages, and square feet to each of our properties, and we determined the average sale price to be $351,691.
All right, so to conduct our cost approach analysis, we took the estimated reproduction cost of the improvements to the land, which we got from the source below, and subtracted out the accrued depreciation on those improvements to get the depreciated cost of the improvements to the land. And then we added back the estimated value of the site to get the indicated value by the cost approach, which was $199,000 or $199,804, which was a lot lower than the price that the house sold for and the other evaluations, which is likely due to the high demand. And so for the income approach, using the direct capitalization approach, the gross income was calculated using the rent estimate from Zillow. Then the monthly expenses were subtracted from the gross income, and net operating income was found. This was then divided by the cap rate, which was determined to be 7%. The resulting number is the estimated home value, which was $169,528, which was obviously lower than the expected one, which would lead us to consider not renting this property. And then the discounted cash under the discounted cash flow method, the holding period was 10 years, which would be used to obtain the present value of the cash flow. The cash flow per year was determined to be $11,867, which we determined from the direct capitalization approach. This was discounted for 10 years with the estimated sales price being added to the 10th year. The cash flow for the cash flow calculation, we used the bank rate of 3.22%, which we determined from research. After all the calculations, the present values were added together and provided an estimated value of $222,000 or $222,064. And then this slide is just kind of going over what I said in the slides before and just kind of there for permanence.
Okay, so we used three approaches for our reconciliation. It was the sales comparison, the cost approach, and the income approach to our 3-bed, 2-bath Austin home. So the sales comparison provided 6 comparable properties that were similar to the subject property, and we adjusted them based on the number of bedrooms, year built, number of garages, and the square footage. And this method ended up being the most accurate for our reconciliation, so we weighted it with 70%. And our next method that we used was the cost approach. And this determined how much a house would cost to be replicated with today's materials and land prices. And the replication cost is determined by subtracting the depreciation and land value from the replication cost. And due to the age of our home, the depreciation expense was considerably high, and it considered the heavy market real estate traffic outside of Austin, Texas. So the land value we determined and subtracted is most likely overpriced. And so because of this, we decided to only apply 10% to the reconciliation value. So the next approach that we did was the income approach, and we split this up into 2 categories, which is the direct capitalization method and the discounted cash flow method. These approaches are typically used for commercial real estate that is used for generate high rental revenues. And since our subject property is a single family home, the income approach becomes hard to estimate because we are not generating any type of income. So, but that being said, we determined that 20% of the income approach would be reconciled, with 5% going to a direct capitalization method and 50% to the discounted cash flow method. And so after the reconciliation was completed, we've determined that the property value is $307,950. And this price is lower than the asking price of the home, which is $346,000. So that tells us that the home is overpriced. And this is due because of how competitive the market is currently, and it's something that needs to be considered.
So, as with anything, COVID-19 had its impacts on the housing market. There was a downward trend in home sales in the spring of 2020, which was the lowest level seen since the financial crisis of 2007. Although we did have a rebound in the summer of 2020. We saw a demand decrease, and a lot of people ended up working from home, and job security wasn't as stable as before. But these steady prices were due to low interest rates and low supply. We had an all too familiar housing bubble threat, and we also saw changes in lifestyles with a lot more upsizing and spending more on the home. And we actually saw a big number of people moving away from cities and more outwards towards suburbs and just getting farther away, mostly due to probably the spread of COVID with being in close quarters. And on the bright side, the Austin market was virtually unscathed and had a record-breaking number of sales of 40,165. Below attached, you'll see our works cited page, and that will wrap up our appraisal project.